Get started, everybody. So I want to say good late morning, good early afternoon. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I'm the co-director of the Center for Ideas and Society, and I'm professor in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies here at UC Riverside. It's a privilege to welcome everybody to Hot Off the Presses, Freedom Inside Yoga and Meditation in the Carceral State, authored by our colleague, our friend, our comrade, Professor Farah Godrej. I want to open the occasion by acknowledging Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside, including epistemological, archival, and physical forms of Indigenous thought and being. The University of California is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by original and ongoing human caretakers, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luceño, and Serrano peoples. This colonial institution continues to be populated by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is blocks away from the site where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller not long before I started working here. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which the university has a cooperating police relationship, is regionally and nationally notorious for creating cruel and fatal conditions in local jails for people awaiting trial and who cannot afford bail. It is a shared responsibility to address how the University of California is actively complicit in long and ongoing histories of anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. It is thus with a sense of urgent obligation that I offer these words in place of the sanctioned so-called land acknowledgement. I'm honored to open this precious occasion by urging all of us to build on Rupert and Jeanette Costo's example by seeking new and old ways to create decolonized, abolitionist, and liberated futures. Welcome, and I'm very happy to pass the microphone to my colleague and friend, Professor Tanya Nieri.
Thanks, Dylan, for the welcome and your comments and your leadership of the center. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you today to learn about this topic. So I'm an associate professor in the sociology department, and my role here is to kind of facilitate discussion. And so what Dr. Godrej and I agreed on beforehand was that I have formulated some questions that will guide her presentation of information. And we'll also have time for you, audience members, to ask questions, share comments, but we'll kind of first go through the questions. If it's a burning question or comment, I think it's okay if you want to put it in the chat or use the reaction buttons to raise your hand, and we can try to address your point immediately. Okay, so let me first introduce our guest, Dr. Farah Godrej. She is an associate professor of political science. She came to the UCR in 2006. With regard to her research, she focuses on political thought and theory. She also, you can tell by the nature of this talk today, focuses on incarceration studies. And she's also particularly interested in meditative and yoga traditions. She is active in the Riverside Faculty Association, and she is one of the leaders, along with Amos Lee, a faculty member in education, of the Prison Education Initiative, which is organizing a group of faculty to develop and provide UCR education within a local prison facility. So today we have the privilege of learning about Dr. Godrej's book titled Freedom Inside, Yoga and Meditation in the Carceral State. And so this is a book that investigates why people who are incarcerated participate in yoga and meditation, what they're seeking, and regardless of why they participate, what they get from that experience. She also looks at how the context of the prison environment influences the motivation to participate and the effects of participation in those activities, both the effects on the individual and on the system. So I look forward to our discussion today. So welcome, Dr. Godrej, and thanks for being here. So maybe to start, I'd like you to just introduce us to your study. What were your research questions? What motivated you to do this study, and how did you go about conducting it?
For that really generous introduction. And before I leap in, I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize the work of the Center for Ideas and Society, and particularly, as Tanya said, the leadership of my friend, my good friend and colleague, Dylan Rodriguez, and Also, the incredible efforts of Catherine Henshaw. And I just want to express my gratitude to the center, not just for this opportunity to talk about my work, but also for the fact that much of the field work and the field research that I did for this book was actually supported by funding from the center. So much gratitude to everyone at the center, and much gratitude to you, Tanya, for being my interlocutor and facilitator today. So with that said, I think the best way to describe the main points of the book is to start by talking about two kinds of responses that I typically got when I would ask people who had been incarcerated, what was the point and purpose of yoga and meditation for them during that time? So one kind of response I got, and I'll just use, a pseudonym here for one of my interviewees, was a guy named Lee who said, as I got involved with Buddhism and meditation, I realized I created my own suffering. I made choices that led to all the suffering within myself. I needed to learn to accept responsibility for my poor choices. And I needed to learn, that's what I got out of studying Buddhist philosophy and meditation, that I have to accept these circumstances because they're self-created, right? Due to my own sort of pathologies that I need to transform. Now, that's one kind of response. The second kind of response I got was from a different person named Michael, who said, well, actually, meditation practice started to teach me how to see my own conditioning and to think and inquire, not just internally, but externally. In other words, to inquire critically into the root of my circumstances, to see how much suffering is collectively caused, particularly by the prison system. He said, why don't we give more leeway to folks who come from really rough backgrounds? Why do we have such long sentences? Where did I learn that it's okay to get such a long sentence for such a, relatively minor infraction? And so in this second case, right, so there's a kind of paradox between these two sorts of responses, right? In one case, they seem to entail the belief that one's circumstances, including one's suffering, are self-created. And in the other case, they inspired a kind of sharper and more critical examination of the systemic and collective causes of that suffering. So it was the paradox between these two kinds of views that really motivated the entire project. And I had many years of personal training in what I call the yogic and meditative traditions. And certainly that's a very broad, right, way to characterize the traditions I'm talking about. But, I had been trained from a relatively young age in some of its key principles, like non-attachment and non-judgment, and learning that, life in the material world is transient and ultimately illusory. And importantly, to see suffering as created by our own minds rather than by circumstances, and to accept those external circumstances as the way to release suffering. So I had all this training, right, and all these like core principles. But the question that I kept coming back to over the years was, well, what about collective suffering, right? Are we just supposed to accept that things like inequity and injustice are all part of the fluctuation of life, or even worse, created by our own minds, right? Because surely injustice, which is caused by powerful political structures, exists as a cause of suffering in the world, collective suffering, no matter how our minds choose to view it. So I kept coming back to this question of, what can these traditions tell us about balancing, on the one hand, this non-reactivity and this acceptance with, on the other hand, a very justifiable opposition to social and political oppression? So that's what motivated the study and led me inside prisons to investigate. So why did I choose prisons, right? Well, a foundational premise of my book, which is, I think, likely shared by most people in the room, and of course speaks, right, to many of Dylan's opening remarks, is that the prison system is one of the most egregious sites of inequity and injustice and state-sponsored violence in our society, right? Again, I'm echoing much of what Dylan kicked us off with. And I'm not going to say too much more about that here. There's plenty more to be said about it, of course, for those who want to know more about it. But I'll just say that, it's pretty clear to me that when we look at things like the disproportionate and exponentially higher rates at which people from poor communities and communities of color and immigrant communities are incarcerated, when we look at the criminalization of a large variety of nonviolent offenses, when we look at all the ways in which the state legally discriminates against and disenfranchises, right, people who have been incarcerated, and when we look at the network of entrenched interests that profit financially from imprisonment, we see, as one scholar has said, that the structural rules guaranteed discriminatory results. So that's a foundational premise of the book, right? That this is a truly egregious site of injustice and inequity. And then I started to notice that there were quite a few organizations that were offering yoga and meditation programs inside prisons. So I started to wonder, well, exactly how were these practices being taught, right? Were they being taught in ways that would sort of promote political passivity, that would be a kind of palliative tool for people to accept and cope and comply with their miserably unjust existence? Why would I worry about this? Well, I started reading many commentaries by contemporary scholars who started to express concern that as yogic and meditative traditions had proliferated in the West, there was this tendency for them to overemphasize the kind of inward, private, individualized aspects of these teachings, which can encourage us to see all misfortune as largely of our own making, instead of looking at, right, the systemic and structural and collective causes of social and political suffering. And you can see this when you see that, mindfulness and yoga are now being taught at corporations, governments, military organizations, right? Mindfulness is being taught to kids in public schools to make them more calm and more disciplined. I'm going to put these words in quotes for reasons that I hope will become obvious, but no critical inquiry into these structures like race and class, which are the source of their stress in the first place, right? Nobody wants to ask about those larger structures. So I started to think and sort of follow this concern that, these traditions and practices could end up supporting a very neoliberal worldview. And in this instance, I'm defining neoliberalism as a worldview that says individual choice and behavior are the catch-all solution to everything. And if individuals behave correctly, collective issues will sort themselves out, right? Which I think is a deeply, deeply insidious kind of logic. But I also knew from personal experience, from my practice, and from studying the work of Gandhi, that these yogic and meditative practices could be transformative in ways that actually give people tools to develop critical capacities and their awareness of collective suffering. And this is something I really learned from studying the work of the Indian nationalist political thinker Gandhi, right? That being a practitioner of yoga or meditation was not exclusive with critique and activism and challenge and disruption. And acceptance did not have to equal passivity. And that internal calm and peace can also actually allow for productive action upon justifiable anger. So that's the question that drives my book, right? How do these forces work when these self-disciplinary practices like yoga and meditation are taught inside an unjust system? Do they encourage people to sort of adopt this logic that, we just have to improve ourselves and that's how we address systemic injustice? Or can they actually encourage critical, non-conformist thinking? And lastly, the way I went about this study is that, between August of 2016 and March of 2020, so it was almost 4 years, I volunteered with organizations which were offering yoga and meditation inside local prisons and jails. I tried to get at these questions in a variety of ways through my personal experiences of volunteer work, through observing and participating in yoga and meditation classes inside various facilities, attending trainings that were held both by prisons as well as volunteer organizations, and eventually sort of taking on a kind of leadership role in several of these organizations. And meanwhile, the network of relationships I established through all of this allowed me to produce over 60 in-depth, semi-structured interviews with both volunteers who taught inside prisons and formerly incarcerated practitioners. So much of the book is based on academic research, but a lot of it is also based on my personal experiences of volunteer work, personal narrative, and in one case, collaboration and co-authorship, a co-authored piece of writing with 2 of my yoga students who were at the time incarcerated.
Thank you for that. So just as you set up kind of the sort of dual possibilities of benefits and shortcomings, my understanding is that, your results were really quite nuanced. You did not find an easy picture. You found a complicated picture. So for example, you found that yoga and meditation practices on the inside were positive in some respects and for some people, but negative in other respects and for some other people. So could you please talk about those results and give us some examples from your data?
Thanks. So for all the reasons I've just described, I entered prison work with a great deal of personal ambivalence, right? And I found that the project partially confirmed a lot of my intuitions and concerns that I went in with, but it also caused me to rethink some other concerns and intuitions in ways that, as you say, did not lead to any simple conclusions. So as I've already indicated, right, throughout this book, I sort of explore these two different models or ways of teaching and receiving these practices inside prisons. And I offer the caveat that the sort of binary division between these two models or two perspectives doesn't actually fully explain everything, so that it's not necessarily an either or lens. So let me first describe, right, what these two models. The first model, or narrative, I like to call it, what I'm calling the predominant narrative that I uncovered through my interviews, through ethnography, through personal experience, is that yoga and meditation were being taught to incarcerated persons and often received in a way that promoted compliance toward the prison's logic. In other words, the prison's logic that only individual defects cause suffering, right? The suffering of incarceration. So repeatedly, I saw incarcerated persons receiving and repeating the message that they must deal with their own discomfort, their own suffering, learn to transcend their circumstances, focus only on improving themselves through self-help, focus on the internal mental causes of suffering, not the unjust external circumstances. And so I really saw over and over again that people were often being taught to retool their emotional and cognitive terrain to reconceive an unjust or miserable reality as a personal choice, right? To adjust and accept and eventually cope and function more effectively within an unjust status quo. And this was particularly insidious because prisons, as I say in the book, are places where inequality and subordination are taught and learned and reproduced. So this message of acceptance and self-transformation that was coming from the yogic practices would often dovetail with an entire culture of what I call rehabilitation rhetoric. Prisons and jails are replete with these self-help and psychology programs like substance abuse and anger management and parenting classes, to name just a few, right? All of these programs are emphasizing behavioral changes for people to make better choices and inculcate a sense of personal responsibility. And it's really a form of indoctrination, right? People are sort of indoctrinated into repeating the message that their own flawed individual choices and their lack of discipline are responsible for incarceration. And anytime somebody attempts to point to sort of structural or systemic issues, right, it's considered evidence of resistance to rehabilitation, and it gets marked down in your file, and it can lead to negative assessments, or worse, affect your chances for early release or parole. And so this is why many scholars say that these self-help and therapeutic programs function to keep the already excluded in their place. So, one example, I'll just give one very quick example, is from a person named Danny, who I interviewed, and he had served 21 years for being involved in attempted robbery, but an attempted robbery in which he did not discharge a weapon, nor did he injure anybody. And he was offered a plea deal of 4 consecutive life sentences. And he chose to go to trial along with his co-defendants, and he described this trial process that was riddled with procedural irregularity and conflict of interest and misconduct, and he felt that his sentence was deeply, deeply unjust. He got, 20 plus years. But then over time, as he practiced Buddhism and meditation and yoga, he said, over time, I came to accept my time. I deserved it because your own action causes your karmic situation. I did the crime, so I'm responsible for any consequences. And instead of trying to blame everything on the outside situation, I internalized it more. Like, if someone is angry at me, well, what did I do to make them angry? That's really the teaching of the Buddha, right? He says, your mind is the creation of events, whether good or bad. So what's really striking here is that even somebody who, felt that the sentence they were given was extremely unjust and sort of riddled with all kinds of conflicts of interest, eventually sort of enthusiastically would endorse a story and a theme of personal defects and poor decision making and having only themselves to blame. So that's what I'm calling the predominant narrative. But there was also this, what I'm calling a dissenting narrative, in which these traditions and practices were really being taught to people as resources for challenging and resisting injustice, not necessarily always through action, but often internally through the realm of belief, right? So people were practicing self-cultivation or self-transformation, but with a very specific emphasis on the awareness of the social and political and structural causes of incarceration, right? And the injustice in which they were mired. And so, for instance, I'll quote from one of my interviewees, Emil, who said, "Yoga and meditation made me see more clearly, understand the complexity, and see incarceration as a systemic problem, and realize that the system is messed up. All the other programs encourage you to ignore the systemic level and think it's all my fault. But instead, my meditations shifted my viewpoint and helped me understand what had happened to me." So that was Emil. And here's actually one of my co-authors who I collaborated and co-wrote a chapter of the book with. She goes by the pseudonym Maitra. And Maitra said, "There's a difference between simply using yoga and meditation to relax and become passive and just feel better about your situation, and using it to meet challenge in a constructive way. I remember one of the yoga teachers giving us instructions about holding warrior two, which is a yoga pose, one day, and she talked about recognizing your discomfort, but then using that discomfort to meet challenge and develop your own knowledge, right? So this was the kind of cultivation of an oppositional or resistant consciousness. But I do want to say, right, as I've already indicated, that these two models or narratives were not mutually exclusive. They often overlapped. And there was a kind of important theme beyond the sort of binary of these two views, which is that incarcerated people were often able to employ these practices to assert a kind of internal freedom and control in the face of the continuous dehumanization and institutionalized violence that they would face, right? So of course we have the obvious differences between these two perspectives, but I would say that both kinds of respondents were able to express an internal freedom that really defied the institution's capacity to control and define their lived experience, so that their inner lives would become a crucial arena of resistance. And you can sort of defy the system's capacity to define your lived experience, and you can still feel human despite the truly brutal indignities that you routinely suffer, because these practices could become a kind of armor, right? A new tool to survive the continuous psychic and physical assault on their interview participants said, in the face of that routine violence, my yoga practice opened my eyes to the superhero inside me.
Thank you for that. So this next question is a bit lengthy, so bear with me here. So your study shared information not only about practitioners in prison, but also the volunteers in prison. And so, I want to ask you to please share your results on volunteers and also comment on the following, which is related. So in thinking about volunteers in prison, I was reminded of two literatures that exist. One of them is on the human services industry. So for example, Teresa Gowan's work, her book labeled Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders, the Homeless in San Francisco from 2010. In her book, she likens the human services industry, which she calls the homelessness industrial complex, to the prison industrial complex, arguing that it ultimately operates to sustain itself and not to help homeless people or unhoused people. There's another literature on voluntourism, right? People taking vacations to volunteer. So the tourism industry aims to provide volunteer opportunities ostensibly so people can learn about the world and make it a better place. But the research shows that it ultimately ends up exploiting communities, reinforcing oppressive stereotypes, and empowering only the tour companies themselves. So with these literatures in mind, can you talk about the volunteers in prison yoga programs, their contributions and value, and any concerns about their involvement?
Thank you. Such a great question, Tanya. And I definitely saw some real parallels between what you're describing and the work of yoga and meditation volunteers in prisons. And I'll say more about that in just a second. So I interviewed 36 fellow volunteer yoga or meditation instructors, or facilitators, I should say. And these were a mix of people who were either fellow, volunteers in the local communities that I was already volunteering in, so I knew many of them personally, and others were from other parts of the country, other organizations, often, quote unquote, leading organizations that were thought to be, right, sort of leaders and innovators in the prison yoga world. So I found again that the predominant response when I asked people, what was the purpose of their teaching inside prisons? The predominant response I got was something like, oh, to make prisoners better and to reduce crime, so that incarcerated individuals can improve themselves through better choices and more personal responsibility. And so these practices were being offered for many of my respondents as a way for incarcerated people to accept their own role in creating their own circumstances. And the logic there was social and political change requires inner change by individuals. And so the really striking thing was that so many of these volunteers would say, oh yes, absolutely, incarceration, unjust system, terrible, terrible injustice. And then in the same breath, they would say, oh yes, we can change the system, right? We address systemic injustice by changing individuals, right? So just to give you a few examples of this predominant view, right? Here's one person who's actually a monk, originally from Southeast Asia, and he said that practices like yoga and meditation reform the incarcerated person to become a better human being. People who go to prison, they are doing all these bad things. If somebody can show them the path. Here's somebody else, a very senior person in one of the most well-known organizations in the country, who said yoga and mindfulness practices are a behavioral rehabilitative aid for people to manage themselves in a way that relieves them of suffering. Self-control, impulse control, opportunities for personal transformation, staying out of trouble, calming down, becoming accountable to themselves and their community, an opportunity to reflect on their bad habits and behavior, becoming less impulsive. I mean, one could go on and on with these kinds of responses. One person said, if people aren't going back to jail, it's because they're starting new and better practices. They're taking responsibility for their lives. So I saw a great deal of really, really very, very troubling stereotyping in the responses from this sort of predominant group, right? These sweeping generalizations about incarcerated individuals playing a moralizing role for a class of people who need instruction about living in society. One person said, and this is a direct quote, I swear I'm not making this up, yoga is such a marvelous way of taking a broken, undisciplined individual and giving them some guidance. Some of them are like little puppies at the pound. We want to go in and socialize them. Exact quote, I promise you. So all of these, right, responses that fell into what I'm characterizing as the predominant narrative were very much, I think, in keeping with what you have identified, Tanya, as, the parallel to what you talked about is what I would call what many scholars have called the nonprofit industrial complex, right? That so many of these volunteers were so kind of preoccupied with perpetuating and reproducing their organization, right? And the funding structure and everything that sort of got funneled into, right, making that organization more robust, that was the priority, right? Much more so than thinking critically in any way about sort of what they were bringing into this space. Now, as always, there was a kind of dissenting view, right? A sort of a dissenting view which offered these same practices, but again, as means to skillfully navigate an unjust system by preserving your sense of self, right? So instead of saying, okay, inner change by individuals is what's going to lead to systemic change, there was a kind of insistence in this second dissenting view on situating that kind of change within the acknowledgement of systemic injustice. So here's one person from that kind of dissenting group who said, yoga is a form of self-regulation, not so that we can be okay with things that are wrong, but so that we can develop strategies for liberation in a more effective way. If we have just stopped with tolerating discomfort, we become a tool for keeping people down. So a lot of the volunteers in this, what I'm calling this dissenting group, really rejected the concept of rehabilitation, right? And they said, you need to address the deeper causes, right, of these structural issues. And if you don't do that, you're only putting in place another form of oppression. It may be a nice oppression, but it's still oppression. This is how they characterized, right, the rehabilitative logic. One of them said, and this is actually one of my favorite quotes, he said, the idea that you can make a slave on a plantation happier, but they're still a slave on a plantation. We're just teaching them how to deal with their anxiety or their anger so that they can feel better and they're less likely to come back to prison because they've been able to deal with their stress. But we're not actually understanding and responding to the collective causes of what's going on. And many of the volunteers, respondents in this group talked very bluntly about how they saw North American yoga culture as politically uninformed, right? As a tendency to think of yoga as something apolitical, to use yoga as kind of spiritual bypass, to say, oh, you know, these yogic ideas, these fluffy ideas like, oh, everything happens for a reason, or that's just somebody's karma why they're in this situation. So a real sort of fierce critique of, you know, the lack of critical thinking within the yoga world, right? So again, these kind of two narratives, right? Those who would, on the one hand, repeatedly condemn the institutionalized racism of the prison system, but then in the same breath, speak of incarcerated persons as though their actions were freely chosen, right, outside of any structural constraints. And this insistent focus on people changing, right, seeking to treat and reform and remake individuals and asking people to look within for the answers to their problems, right? And all of this very often dovetailed with the imperative for organizations to bring in funding, right? And when that imperative is paramount, then you have to repeat and parrot the logic of the system. But it's not just that you repeat and parrot it, right? With an awareness, a lot of people had completely internalized and bought into this logic. But of course, again, in contrast, right, there was this second narrative where, you know, volunteers were very keenly and astutely, I think, tuned in to this idea of, you know, we don't just make individuals better in order to produce social justice. That's not what social justice is consisting of, right? It's not that these volunteers were opposed, right, to self-regulation or self-discipline, right? No one was saying we're not interested in self-improvement, but rather the idea was that these goals of self-improvement and self-transformation had to be combined with the political goals of challenging the inequity and injustice of the system, right? So that people could be encouraged to be subversive and disruptive and less, right, accepting of the prison's authority, not necessarily in action. I want to be very clear because those actions have tremendous consequences, right, while one is incarcerated, but at least, right, internally in one's outlook and one's mental state.
Thank you for that. So, you know, my understanding is that you, well, obviously as a volunteer, but you know, are a yoga practitioner, perhaps also a meditation practitioner. So, you know, you have embodied knowledge of what those activities can do for a person. And so you also have some sense of what it feels like to do those activities within prison, right? And so I'm curious about that particular experience, but not just, so first of all, your own embodied experience and how that led you to the study, and then your embodied experience during the study, right? And how that shaped the study itself, your findings and your interpretations. Could you talk about that, please?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I came to this practice, as I think I've mentioned, you know, having grown up in India in a very sort of traditional South Asian, relatively traditional, I should say, South Asian context. And I first came to both yoga and meditation through the very traditional guru-disciple model of practice, which was very predominant in and is still predominant in India. And it's a model in which, you know, the student submits themselves to the expertise and the authority of the teacher and submits to the knowledge and, you know, the expertise of the teacher, right? And this is something a series of, you know, traditional presumptions that I grew up with. And of course, as I became an immigrant, came to the West, you know, and continued my practice in the West, I saw that in sort of Western studio culture, right, yoga culture, within studios, and you know, mindfulness culture in sort of Western meditation centers, much of this was being replicated, right? That many yoga teachers were often sort of harking back to the lineage of which yoga guru they had studied with, right? And very much the kind of very punitive, rigorous authority of the kind of yoga guru would be replicated in the studio culture. And so that was very much my experience, except that I didn't have occasion to reflect on it until I started going inside prisons. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is for, you know, decades of my own practice, both in India and the West, I had never given any thought to the fact that, you know, people who taught yoga just came up to you and adjusted your body without ever asking for consent. And so if you were holding a pose, you know, in a studio setting, somebody would just come up and move your foot and say, okay, we're going to move your foot there because you need a longer stance in this warrior pose, or I'm going to move your arm so that it's a little bit lower, right? And it had never occurred to me, because I came out of this very, right, traditional guru disciple model, and I saw that being replicated in many of the studios where I practice. The question of consent, bodily autonomy, just never occurred to me, right? And sort of an embarrassing thing for me to now admit, but I was so kind of embedded in one way of thinking about yoga and meditation, and all of this completely shifted and transformed once I started teaching inside prisons, and became exposed to what is now commonly called trauma-informed yoga and meditation, which is this idea that, we don't need to obsessively fetishize and replicate the kind of authenticity of the South Asian lineage. That is far less important than adapting these practices to the needs of the people in this specific context. And so what I started learning from, various trainings I took and from various teachers I watched inside the prison setting is we needed to be much more invitational rather than commanding in the language that we used, right? So instead of saying, put your arms here, put your feet here, have your gaze here, I started softening the language I would use, and I would invite people. I'd say, I'll invite you to experiment with what works in your own body. I'll give you some choices. You can place your feet here, here, or here. You can have your eyes in this position or this position, and, just see what works for you. And I'll invite you to explore in your own body, right? This is something you will never hear if you go to, like, quote unquote, study in India at the source, whatever that even means, right? If you sort of fetishize a particular lineage and go follow, I don't know, the Iyengar school of yoga or whatever it is, and you go to India to take a training, you will never hear anything like that, right? And I started to realize that issues of touch and consent were really, really paramount. And I started to see this even as I started to see kind of a resistance to these ideas among many of the volunteers that I was working with, right? And I would bring these issues up and I would say, well, don't you think we need to think a little bit about bodily autonomy and consent for touch in a context like the prison, where people are routinely being invasively and violently touched without their own consent? Right? And people would be like, no, I think adjustment is really important. We really need to teach people how to do the pose rightly. And people really need to be told what to do. That's how my, yoga guru taught me. And it actually became like a bone of contention and sort of made me quite unpopular. Maybe that's overstating it. I don't know. It sort of made me stick out as a sore thumb among some of my fellow volunteers who were like, what is all this newfangled, right? Trauma-informed stuff. Yoga is yoga is yoga. This is how it's been traditionally taught. We don't need to sort of go off the rails and make it all loosey-goosey. But meanwhile, I was, speaking with incarcerated people who were women who were describing, for instance, how every time they had like visiting day where their families were allowed to come visit them, they had to submit to an invasive cavity search every single week, right? And they sort of would describe the kind of humiliation and violence of that cavity search. And I sort of immediately found myself changing completely, not just how I practiced personally in my own personal practice, but how I facilitated and offered the practice inside prisons with my incarcerated, friends and students. And I just completely swore off not only touching people. I just felt less and less confident that I would know when my touch would unwittingly cross the line from, healing and supportive to harsh and triggering. So I went through a whole sort of journey, I would say, in which I just completely re-envisioned what yoga practice meant to me. And I completely rethought all of my training, right? And all of my sort of attachment to tradition and lineage and classical yoga, the rigor of classical yoga, all of that has gone out the window. And I have started to think in terms of things like autonomy and consent. And frankly, that has changed my own personal practice, because I will never again practice in any studio environment where anybody can come up to me and touch me without my consent. That's just not happening. So yeah, those are just some brief examples.
Thank you for that. Well, I have a couple more questions, but I'm going to reserve them in the interest of time, because I'd like to invite our audience members, participants to share, to come forward with any comments and questions if you have any. And you can do that by using the reaction button and raising your hand, or by chatting and I'll call on you, or perhaps just by unmuting and speaking.
And I will apologize for possibly having gone on longer than I should have.
Not at all. It's very rich. I just have lots of questions. That's all.
Tanya, if there are no questions, you're certainly welcome to jump in with some of the other questions you have, but maybe we'll wait to see if folks have other questions.
Yes, I'm trying to do the count to 10, which they recommend, right? For the shy people to get up the nerve. Or the very thoughtful, formulating brilliant questions. Perhaps that's a better way to put it. Or comments. You see, there's Tammy. Go ahead, Tammy.
Hi, Farah. Thank you so much for a fantastic glimpse into what is sure to be a fascinating book. I look forward to reading it. I'm wondering if any of your fellow volunteers have read your book, or, what feedback perhaps that you've gotten from some of the communities you volunteer with or are engaged with. I was just curious about their response to your analysis of these kind of, different kind of modalities, right, within this sphere of labor and service and community engagement.
Thank you for that, Tammy. That's such an important question, and I'm so glad you asked it. I was hoping somebody would ask. And one of the things I tried to do was, it's a practice that is in interpretive ethnographic work. It's called member checking, where, when you do this kind of immersed ethnographic work, it's considered really good practice for some of your key interlocutors to actually see your draft before publication so that they have an opportunity to correct and sort of offer their correctives even before, right? The manuscript goes to publication, so that you can integrate precisely some of the sort of disagreement or exchange or back and forth, and be transparent with the reader, right, about how your work was received by the very people who made it possible. So keeping this in mind as the project developed and as I saw the direction things were going in, I had a huge amount of anxiety, because I could kind of see the writing on the wall, and I thought, here are all these people who facilitated my work. They welcomed me into these volunteer communities. They made it possible, right? I was deeply, keenly aware of how much I owed them, what a debt I owed them, which is not to speak, of course, of my debt to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, which is another massive debt that I really carried with me. But at least, the volunteers, much more privileged, right? Relatively privileged people, but people who had gone out of their way to welcome me and embrace me. So I did, first of all, share the draft manuscript, right? The entire draft manuscript with several key interlocutors. And, unsurprisingly, they pushed back. Some of them said, I was really taken aback to see that this was the thrust of your argument. I didn't realize, right? Because a lot of these people, right, when you say, oh, I volunteered to teach yoga in prisons, and now this academic wants to come be part of my group and study what I'm doing, what's the immediate assumption they have? They immediately assume, oh, they're going to talk about how great this all is, right? And then they read this manuscript and they're like, oh, wait a minute. And most of them said, I never even thought about these things. It shocked me. Some of them said, it really shocked me that this is what you came up with. I will say that overall, those exchanges remained quite kind and civil. I make no mistake, it was definitely jarring to these people that a lot of them had not considered it. Some were, very grateful and very on board and said, I'm so glad you're doing this. This is really important. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of people you send your manuscript to, they're not going to read it, right? So that's something that anybody who's done member checking knows. Like, you send it out and you hope for. So what I did is I actually integrated some of the pushback into the final version of the manuscript. So I have a whole section in my conclusion where I actually lay out all the ways in which, some of the people about whom I had been more critical sort of spoke back to me, and I integrated what I'm calling the talk back into the manuscript. More broadly, Tammy, the broader answer to your question is a lot of people don't want to hear it. And these are not just fellow volunteers who I volunteered with, but other people in the kind of yoga and meditation space to whom I've been presenting the results of the book, not necessarily people I knew before I wrote the book, but people who have sort of, come to the book later and wanted to know about it. a lot of them don't really want to hear it. And I think that it is for many of them quite unpleasant to hear that this service work that they've been doing in some cases for decades. I mean, I have to say that there is a deep commitment, and some of these people have been at this really for many, many, many years. So I do want to recognize and honor and acknowledge that, right? But for a lot of them, it's a bit of a shock for them to hear that there are these kind of darker, more insidious underpinnings to what they're doing, and have it sort of called out by someone who, you know, frankly, they were pretty nice to, right? And gave a lot of opportunity to. So I'm keenly aware of that. It was a huge source of anxiety for me. And I remember thinking, oh God, you know, what if one of them says, I retract my approval for you to, you know, write about anything I told you? I mean, I had all these like nightmare scenarios. I lost so much sleep, I can't even tell you. But then I thought, you know what, be that as it may. But I will say that there are plenty of others, not as many, few, who have said, this is such important work. I'm so glad you're saying this. I thought this for so many years, but I didn't know how to express it, or nobody wanted to hear this stuff, so I just kept quiet. I never talked about it. So I would say it's been a mix, right? But for the most part, I am not holding my breath, let's say, for this book to become required reading in any of the organizations that I trained with or studied. It's rubbing a little bit too much against the bone for a lot of people. But thank you so much for asking that, Tanya.
Thank you, Tammy, for the question, and Farah for the response. So Catherine provided a question. It says, do practitioners inside primarily practice in groups or alone?
That is also a great question, Catherine. Primarily, I would say in groups, right? The way it works is that, you know, yoga or meditation classes fall again under the rubric inside prisons of rehabilitative programming, right? And so it's usually a program that happens in a kind of group context. And so it's usually once a week, right? You go in and and really you teach a yoga class or a meditation class in just the same way that you would in a studio or center setting, quote unquote, on the streets or on the outside. So in some ways, these classes really quite closely mirror what you would expect a yoga or meditation class to look like, right, in the outside world. However, I will say that many of the most dedicated yogis who I got to know would take the practice with them and go practice on their own time, alone, individually, in their housing units, right, in their downtime. And some of them turned into, I mean, really some of the most dedicated yogis I've known, who were practicing, you know, daily, if not multiple times a day. And then some of them actually ended up leading classes inside the prison for their fellow incarcerated people, and became sort of teachers and leaders on the inside, so that on days when we were not coming in to offer class, they were offering the practices, right, to their friends and roommates and others. So I would say the short answer to your question, Catherine, is both, right? There's both a group setting as well as a kind of individual practice for those who wanted to take it further.
Other questions or comments? Ina.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for this. And I have to share, just because I've been thinking this for the last 50 minutes, like my kid refuses to have anything to do with meditation, yoga, any of this, because he was punished so often in public school for not being quiet and not sitting still during meditation. And it's, I guess and I know this is just like a relative to the weight of your scholarship. This is like a small comment, but I had to share that because I'm very sad about that. And also it really just, I mean, it puts that experience in a different frame, I guess, to think about. And I've just been thinking through, like, what would it possibly mean to, because I know these teachers are, and many, much like your volunteers, are doing this, you know, in their minds for the benefit of the students and to help them survive the experience of public school, and what it would mean to sort of reconfigure this to allow for a more counter-institutional experience. But really, it's just a thank you for this work. It's totally fascinating.
Thank you, Dana. And it's not a small comment. It's not at all a small comment. It actually speaks very directly to what I was talking about earlier, which is the kind of trauma-informed model, one of the things I learned when I was studying trauma-informed yoga and meditation is it can be deeply jarring and in fact terrifying to somebody who is a victim of trauma to have them sit in silence, because it can bring up really difficult thoughts. And so one of the things we do in trauma-informed meditation is not have any silence, to have continuous guidance and say, okay, we're going to be here for a couple more seconds. Now we're going to do this. Now we're going to do that, right? Now we're going to take the mind here. And so leaving people in silence can actually be terrifying in a context where trauma is the norm rather than the exception. And the other thing I adopted as part of trauma-informed yoga was, if you just want to lie there on your mat and not do the same pose that I'm instructing, go for it. Do whatever you want to do. You don't have to put your body in the shape that I am recommending everyone put the body in. So actually what you're describing is 100% relevant to and very much, central, I think, to what I've been describing in the book. So I can't thank you enough for bringing that up.
So we have two more questions. I see Dylan has his hand raised, and Stanley Sharkey in the comments asked a question. I'll read his question, and maybe Dylan, you can ask your question, and in the remaining time, you can answer those questions before we conclude. So Stanley said, could you expand on some of the difficulties associated with teaching the practice to incarcerated persons who should accept blame for their actions, quote unquote, when deserved, or not quote unquote, in parentheses, when deserved, while also still highlighting the systemic conditions that led to their actions? And then Dylan, did you want to just ask your questions, and then we'll conclude with Farah's answer to both?
Yeah, I think there's a question embedded somewhere. It's more of just thinking out loud, and I just wanted to think with Farah on this because my wheels were turning as I was listening to everything that you said today. So first of all, thank you both for offering this to the community today. When I think of the practice of yoga in a certain tradition that's embraced by incarcerated people inside, I think of a couple of things. One thing is I think about how there's a certain insurgent and insurrectionist praxis around yoga that incarcerated people embrace as part of preparation for guerrilla warfare against the state while they're incarcerated. Right. So part of it is a kind of, I think you mentioned this far, part of it is defense against what people call being broken by the state. And then part of it is actually active preparation to surge against the state, including strategic actions against guards, against wardens, and against state officials. So I think of that. And then I think as well about how Huey Newton famously writes about this in Revolutionary Suicide, but he writes about how when he was put in solitary confinement under conditions that were basically just torture, right? That he didn't know yoga, right? But he intuitively started doing what he later realized were yoga poses as a way to survive this really actually high intensity torture of isolation and confinement. So I'm wondering if those traditions, what they do in relation to the framework and the kind of the juxtapositions that you're working with, right, between the kind of consent to the rehabilitative regimen that then gets kind of compounded by this philanthropic and kind of this liberal carceral nonprofit industrial complex approach. And then of course the state's approach, which is to just gaslight incarcerate people all the time so that it turns into, whether or not they accept blame and responsibility for their actions, which I reject that premise altogether. But I just wanted to think with you on that. And I'm just curious what you had. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for these. Gosh, and Tanya is now reminding me that we have 3 minutes. So I'm grappling a little bit to think about how to do justice to these really rich, interventions and provocations in the very short remaining time that we have. I mean, Dylan, I'll just say that, everything you have described, right, came up in my conversations with and my work with, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. I will say that not everyone I spoke with and not everyone I worked with saw the kind of insurgent imperative in the same way that you and I do, right? And that's actually something that I had to sort of grapple with and gave me pause, which is that at the beginning of my time volunteering, I think I had a much more strident and kind of militant view of what I wanted incarcerated people to get out of yoga or meditation, right? I wanted, right, insurgency. I wanted to be sort of encouraging people to think right, rebelliously and disruptively and challenging. But I actually found myself very chastened by the forms of retaliation that I learned about that people faced when they, right, engaged in these kinds of actions. And so over time, I think, I spoke to multiple people who said, yeah, I was sent to the hole, right, solitary for what I did and what I said. And quite a few of them would say, I would rather go to the hole, right, and stand up for my beliefs than not. And so, I just encountered such a range, I think, of perspectives with respect to this kind of insurgency. And I also found that there were occasions when my sort of political education and consciousness raising fell flat, because there were plenty of people who just wanted to sort of keep their head down and get through it and go home to their families. And not everyone was interested in the kind of insurgency and the kind of political consciousness raising. And so, I found myself grappling with this stuff, throughout my work on the inside. And, I don't know that I have like a good, definitive way to respond to what you've raised, except to say that, it really kind of sort of ran the gamut, right, between people who just said, listen, I've got kids, man. I have 3 kids under 10 years old. I just want to get out and get home to them. And then people who said, I am a warrior, right? I'm here to strategize, and I'm here to do what I can to bring this shit down. And I never really knew to this day, I'm not really sure that I, sort of appropriately found my role, right? Anywhere on that spectrum. So that's as much as I think, I want to say now. I think it's a much richer conversation, and there's like a lot more to be said on that. And, to Stanley, to your question, I think, I think that, and I'll be really quick so we can wrap up. I realize we're going over time here. I don't think at any point have I said in this book, or have I, suggested that people could not benefit from the practices of self-improvement, right? Like, we know that everyone can benefit from growth and transformation and self-discipline, but to me, the issue is not about accepting responsibility or, accepting blame for actions. I think the question to me is, what kind of growth or transformation do we want to see among people who are forced to live in prisons, right? Because for me, that transformation and growth cannot come with the non-negotiable price tag of having to deny the very forms of oppression that have contributed to one's predicament, right? So the question for me is not whether anyone should have to take responsibility for personal change, but whether whatever more robust conception of growth we are working with can be made richer and more meaningful without being hamstrung by really absurd denials of these structural and systemic obstacles. So I think I better leave it there for now, given the time. But thank you both.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here and participating, and Farah, for your research and for sharing about it here today. We just thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.